Hello, global gardeners. It's great to see you here on a windy Monday. And I know we've got wind over a lot of the United States. Here in Colorado, it's already started off windy. We're supposed to get up to 50, maybe even 60 miles an hour of wind throughout the day today, partly because it's very, very warm, almost record-setting heat I'm going to have in my garden today. And tomorrow it's going to be about 40 degrees, almost 50 degrees colder as snow moves in. But I'm used to that in Colorado. Lots of big weather moving through the United States. I know a lot of you are experiencing wind as well. Adam already said windy in Central Point, Oregon. And we have Rachel in Maryland that says it's windy. Lars, windy in Minnesota. PD is windy in Virginia. And Derek up the road in Salida is windy. So all of us that are experiencing the wind today, welcome to springtime. That's all part of the weather changing and the patterns rolling across. And I love the spring. I love the transition from winter to spring, but the wind is one of those things I can do without. And today is one of those days where I'd love to be outside doing a lot of things like filming, but it's just going to be too windy. So good to have you all here today. So nice to see everybody checking in. Let's talk some gardening over the next 90 minutes, get your questions answered, and try to get as much information shared as possible. Had an early question from Farmer X72 wondering, how long after the seedlings break ground do I leave the dome on? So when you're starting seeds indoors, I highly recommend using something over those germinating seeds to keep the air humid and help that entire germination process, because the soil needs to stay moist. If you're using a tray system with cells, typically you're going to have a dome. I leave my dome in place for as long as possible to keep that environment for all of the seeds to germinate. But once the seedlings start to touch the dome, once those tallest seedlings would be impacted by a dome in place, that's when I remove the dome. And it may mean that not all the seeds have germinated, but usually by then most have. So leave the dome on until it's basically in the way of the plants. And that holds true for whether you're using plastic bags or any other type of clear plastic material over your plants. When it interferes with the growth of the plants, that's definitely the time to take it off. And was also wondering about the set of true leaves and when you can actually move your plants from under lights into an area with a windowsill or some other grow place that you might have set aside for your plants. I like to leave my seedlings directly under lights for as long as possible as well, because those young seedlings really do benefit from a maximum amount of light. And I usually give them about 16 hours a day, those very young seedlings. But once the true leaves are established and once the plants start growing, they can get by with less light. And especially if you have a direct overhead light, some of those very first leaves, the ones that are on the bottom, won't be getting as much light anymore. And you can move them into another setting, like a really windy windowsill, so that they get sun traveling across the sky through the window. That can be good. I'll usually do that when the plants are bigger. So for me, I'll move them under a secondary set of lights or to a windowsill area. Not in my house now, I don't have south-facing windows. But when they have usually their third or fourth or fifth set of leaves, when the plant is actively growing and I've put it into potting soil, then we can start reducing the light a little bit. And so in my grow area, how I do that is I actually move to a different set of lights. And those lights tend to be on 12 to 14 hours a day. So give yourself some flexibility. It's one of those things to experiment a little bit with. But young seedling, put them directly underneath the light, and that's the best way to do it. Cal1699 is asking about planting onions using the Ruth Stout method. I have not grown onions using the Ruth Stout method. Ruth Stout is basically, the method is where you take hay, in her case. I like to use a lot of straw generally as a mulch. But in vegetable gardening in particular, Ruth Stout heaps up big piles of hay, and then you plant in that hay. And basically, the hay is decomposing and adding the nutrients and also acting as a mulch at the same time. So I have not done onions that way, but if any of you have, go ahead and shout out like we always encourage in our community. If you have an answer and someone asks a question, go ahead and throw your answer out, because we're all here to share information, and that's what it's all about. Connie Davidson is asking, my fig tree died back during the Texas winter. It was so cold for a lot of you this winter. It has a couple of baby leaves coming back from one of the shoots. How far back can I trim the dead off? Whenever you're pruning back the dead branches of a tree or any type of plant, it's best to trim back into live growth. And so look at the branches to make sure where the dead part ends and the live point begins. And if you can identify a bud, go ahead and trim back all the way to that bud. About a 1/4 inch above the bud is often a good place to start. And so if you cut into the live growth part of the branch just above a bud, that's going to encourage that bud to now grow into another branch. And anytime you have damage and you're trying to reinvigorate your tree or your bush or your shrub, that's the way to do it. Cut it back to a growing bud and you should see your best results. Let's see what else we had. We had Vicki Reed. I thought it was interesting, trying a Irish way of the lazy bed. And this is one of those misnomers. There's a type of gardening, very simple, that's called the lazy bed. And it comes from how a lot of Irish grew potatoes many, many years ago. And the misnomer is it takes a lot of work to get a lazy bed growing. But once you get your lazy beds in place, it actually can be quite simple. And so the basic concept in the poor soil of Ireland is they would take a spot in the large garden area, particularly for growing potatoes. And they would take manure and seaweed and they would heap it up into mounds. And this was the primary area where they would plan to grow. And then they would take soil from pathways or areas, usually the beds were about 3 feet wide. And so they would take the soil from the outside of the bed and then heap it into the bed where the seaweed and manure was. And then grow in that raised mound because they've dug out the soil, heaped it on top of seaweed and manure, and it became a preferred method, partly because of the poor soil. So now the manure and the seaweed is enriching the soil. But also in the cool, wet conditions that were in a lot of these areas of Ireland, this raised bed, just a few inches above the surface of the soil, tends to stay warmer and tends to dry out faster. So in Ireland, this lazy bed way of gardening was essentially creating raised beds at ground level. And I've talked about this in some of my videos, and I have a few areas where I'm doing the same thing. In my lasagna garden bed, if you've seen that video, that's the same basic concept, where you're taking organic matter and heaping it and then adding some of your native soil and just building an area a few inches higher than the surrounding ground. And you get some of the benefits of raised bed gardening, which is that it warms up faster and the drainage tends to be better. And because you're making the bed with the intent of enriching the soil, the plants will generally do better. So I say go for it. Go ahead and experiment with the lazy bed idea of gardening that comes from Ireland so many years ago. And I bet you're going to like it. It's a way to do raised bed gardening without having to actually build raised beds out of wood or stone or brick or concrete blocks. You just mound the soil with organic matter and you've got a raised bed. So good for you. I think that's a great way to go ahead and learn new way of gardening as a gardener. That's awesome. Okay, let's see what else we have popping up. Lily's asking, what is the best way to irrigate sweet corn in a ground garden? I'll often put in soaker hoses. I like soaker hoses for my in-ground beds, and especially for an area like corn. And I'll be growing popcorn this year, and I'm actually debating whether I want to do soaker hoses or figure out a different method. I really like hand watering, and so I do most of my watering by hand. And so you can do hand watering, you can do soaker hoses. Corn can actually do pretty well in rows. And so while I'm not a huge fan of furrows and rows in my gardening, you can do that with corn, where you plant the corn in a slightly raised mound, and then you have the depressed area around those rows, and then you can irrigate it by just putting your hose on the rows so that it runs down in between those raised areas, and you can soak the whole area pretty quickly. Especially if you have a mulch in place, it stays wet for a longer period of time. So try a couple of those different ways of doing it. Putting your corn in rows, still in a block. Those rows need to be relatively close together so you have a block of corn growing. But you can set your irrigation up to just have the water drain down the rows, or some soaker hoses as well. Gladys, good to see you here on Mondays. Thank you so much for that super sticker. I'll have a drink of my tea. I appreciate that. That's so nice. Okay, let's see. Riverdale, good to see you, River and Dale, today. River says hi. Hi, River. Back to you. We just had 60 cinder blocks delivered Saturday. Good for you. I just had a brief conversation on the comments this morning from one of my videos talking about cinder blocks, and I love my cinder block bed, and may actually make another one this year, depending on whether I can get to it or not. So good for you. I hope you have time and enjoy the process of putting those cinder blocks in place. Chris, great to see you here this morning. Sorry, a few minutes late. Go, Mr. Goat. Oh, don't worry about being late. In fact, I appreciate everyone that is here that knows that they can't stay for the whole live stream. We already had Yankee Sista check in today saying that she wouldn't be able to be here but would watch it in the replay. So hope you're enjoying the replay. Yankee Sister, the same with Linda Davidson, said she was just checking in to say hello and would watch on replay. So I appreciate that, Chris. No one needs to worry about being late or not checking in. You can always watch all of this on replay, and you can catch up even if you do show up late. I just appreciate all of your interest and all of your support for all of this. So I think that's awesome. And Patrick, thank you. Good to see you as well. Thank you for that super chat. This is just such a great group. I know a lot of you look forward to it, but I definitely am looking forward to every Monday when we can get together and talk about this. And so let's go ahead and talk about another question that came up earlier. Frank Anselmo is getting some asparagus plants and had a question about asparagus, and it's very timely. Many of us are doing asparagus at this time of year as the soil starts thawing, and you can work it and you can get your bed ready and you can put your asparagus roots in. But his question is about the spears, and will they always come up in the same place, or will they spread? And the answer is both. So when you plant your roots, and depending on how established your asparagus roots are, when you look at the crown, you can actually see the little white buds that will form into the spears in the first year. And so in the first year, second year, third year in particular, you're going to get the spears directly above where you plant those roots. And that's one reason why you're placing your crowns and your roots about 18 inches apart, is because you're anticipating the future growth. But for a number of years, you'll only get the spears directly above where you plant your roots. And then over time, the plant will grow and it will start to spread. And so eventually, your whole bed will be filled in with spears. Now, the primary roots will still be those first ones that you planted, but as they continue to grow, they'll start popping up into other places. And you may, and I've had this happen before as well, even though I tried to buy the male plants, asparagus is dioecious, so they're either male or female plants, and you'll usually have the choice to buy male only, so you don't have to worry about the flowers and the berries. But every time I've bought male only plants, there have been some female plants. And I've had some volunteers pop up in some of those areas in the bed. So don't be surprised by that. If you're growing male only asparagus and you're putting the plants in, they'll be directly above that, and then suddenly you'll see these little red berries that pop up on the asparagus at the end of the season. And then the next year, don't be surprised if these little asparagus plants start popping up in an area outside where you planted your primary crowns. It happens. And I just let them grow. You don't know if they're going to be male or female plants, the new ones that pop up, but since a female already crept in anyway, it really doesn't make that much difference. So expect them to spread, Frank, over time, but at least in these first few years, it'll only be in the area where you plant them. Chris, tips on cutting a tree. It fell in a shed, 45 degrees. Yeah, I said that. I saw that you had a tree fall, and that's terrible. I hope it didn't create more damage or work than it's worth. And so I actually, I talked a little bit about it in my hugelkultur video, because I took down a big tree and I just took it one piece at a time. And I started with the side branches with a chainsaw and just started cutting off all the side branches until I got to the main trunk. And what I did, and I'm guessing you can do this as well, Chris, depending on how big the tree is and how big your chainsaw is, but I took a car jack, one of those hydraulic jacks that you use when you need to change a tire, and you put the jack underneath the axle. That's what I did. So I dug a little space underneath the tree, and I put down some concrete blocks, and then I put the jack on those concrete blocks, and I jacked up the top tip of the tree, because those trees, when they fall, are extremely heavy. But a jack that can lift a 3,000-pound car can lift up the edge of the tree. And so that's how I removed my tree, was just a little bit at a time over many hours. And I would jack up the tree tip so that I can cut it off. And then I would lower the jack, dig another hole, jack up the tree, and eventually my tree, I think it was 45 feet tall. And when I was done with it, I was left with pieces that were 4 feet long. And you can see that actually in my garden area now, where I've put some of those big logs and tree stump pieces in the area where I'm putting my pollinator garden. That all came from the same tree, and I just cut it little piece at a time. So if you're good with a chainsaw and you have a car jack, go ahead and try jacking it up little by little, just so you can get all the tips and the branches sawn off. So hope that helps. Kevin says, thanks for all your work. Oh, you're very welcome. Editing a video for the Facebook community has given me more respect for the work you do. Well, thanks, Kevin. That is one of those things that you get better over time. And I also have appreciation for a lot of Facebook and YouTube video makers, because when you edit your videos, you realize that there's a lot of work involved with depending on how much editing you want to do. So I think that's great. My son has a channel. He's younger than me. He's a beer drinker. It's the Brew Captain, and I love his videos. But he's really trying hard to have success on YouTube with his channel. He does reviews of beer. He does how-tos of how to drink beer, but he also has a lot of fun with it. And so he did a video a couple weeks ago for St. Patrick's Day, where he had some amazing visual effects with a leprechaun. He was on screen, and there's a leprechaun dancing around behind him, and he's the leprechaun. So with his editing, he was putting himself in the picture. And so I've actually taken that motivation from my son, and I'll be doing some fun things in videos to come. And so it's a lot of work. Just in that short video he did, he spent hours and hours of editing. So it really is nice. I appreciate that, Kevin, that you say that, because I like doing the work, and I'm doing it for you and all the others who watch the videos. But yeah, it doesn't just happen. So let's see what else we have popping up here. Jerbian is saying, how much earlier can indoor seedlings be put in a greenhouse versus outside? And do they need to be hardened off before putting them there? That's a great question. And so a lot of it depends on your greenhouse. And so I saw someone earlier, there was a little bit of a greenhouse conversation talking about how low the temperatures were outside and how warm the greenhouse was staying. And that's really the key factor. And so I use 50 degrees Fahrenheit and 10 degrees Celsius as my cold target. So when the nighttime temperatures are regularly staying above that temperature, that's when I want to start putting my plants outside. Well, the same holds true with the greenhouse. If I've got a greenhouse that is regularly staying 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius at night, that's when I can put my plants, indoor plants, into that greenhouse. And so start measuring the temperature on a regular basis if you're not already doing it, so that you can get an idea of how cold the greenhouse is getting. And then yes, you do need to harden off your indoor plants, even if you're putting them into a greenhouse. And so one of the ways to do that, when I harden off my plants, I just put them outside my back door on my deck. Well, you would do the same thing, but instead of putting them outside where it might be cooler and windier, harden them off in the greenhouse. But it's a much shorter period of time. You probably won't need to wait a full week. The key difference when you're hardening off in a greenhouse is the sun and the heat. And that's really the main reason for hardening off. Once the temperature is good, you can just put your indoor plants outside and they'll probably do fine based on a temperature that's in that range. The hard part is the sun. You've got your plants in this nice protected area, indoors, under lights, and then you put them out in the full sun and the wind, and that's what tends to damage plants the most. And that's why we harden them off, gradually exposing them to more and more sun, to that harshness of the UV rays. So as you're hardening off into a greenhouse, you need to be very aware of that and anticipate. Put some type of shade, cloth, shade fabric, a big board, whatever it is. But when you first start hardening off your indoor plants into a greenhouse, they need to be protected from the sun as much as they need to be exposed to that warmth that they're going to be growing into. And so generally, when I was at the Galileo garden and we had the 42-foot dome greenhouse, I would put the indoor plants out 4 to 6 weeks early in the greenhouse and then move them from the greenhouse out into the garden once the garden got full sun and began warming up as well. But you might be able to do 2 months early, depending on how warm your greenhouse is and how warm it can stay at night. But generally, 4 to 6 weeks is a good target as far as when you can get your plants into a greenhouse. And so if you're thinking about getting a greenhouse and growing in a greenhouse, and you're already knowing how to grow your plants from seed indoors, well, in all my videos talking about growing seeds, I use the reference point of the last frost date. Well, if you're going to be able to actually put your plants into a greenhouse for that extra growth, you're no longer using the last frost date. You're using a date a month before your last frost date. So learn that flexibility as well in figuring out your seed starting calendar and when you're going to start putting plants outside, because you can probably get an extra 4 to 6 weeks on your season if you've got your greenhouse. So experiment a little bit with it, start keeping track of those temperatures and dates, and have fun with it. Okay, let's see what else we have popping up. Yeah, I thank you for that, Lar. If you've got a specific question, do be sure to put Gardner Scott in your question. And if you put the @ symbol at Gardner Scott, I'm much more likely to see it, because as you probably already see, there's a lot scrolling by, and it's obviously more than I can keep up with. But if you've got something that you really want me to answer, go ahead, and that's the best way to do it. Like Luz Robles is doing at Gardner Scott and everybody else. Does anybody have any experience using Coir as mulch? How does it do with heavy winds? I have not used it as a mulch, partly because of days like this where it's going to be 50 miles an hour, and I have no doubt that the cocoa core would blow away. I use it primarily in potting mixes when I have it, as opposed to a mulch. I think it might be a little light for a mulch, but mixed with straw, you could use it around your vegetable garden beds and it would probably be okay. It is hydrophobic, which means that once it gets dry, it takes an awful lot for it to absorb moisture. And so I prefer mulches that can absorb some water, because then the lower part of that mulch will stay moist and will help keep the soil moist. And so that's one reason why I like straw, because when the straw gets wet, it tends to stay wet. And then especially where it's resting on the soil, that stays relatively evenly moist. Whereas the cocoa core, it's going to shed off a lot of that water. And so that surface connection where it's touching the soil may not be as moist as other choices of mulch. But if you've tried the Coir as a mulch, especially if you're in a lower wind area, go ahead and share that with Luz, and we can see what we think about doing it. Nick from Yuma is saying, my beet seedlings are leggy. I'm sorry to hear that. Go ahead and put more light on them. They can be saved if you can figure out a way to put some light on them. If they're growing outdoors, that's part of the problem. If you put them in a little early before the sun is bright enough to give them enough light during the day. But leggy plants means that they're just not getting enough light. They're searching for the light. The solution is give them more light. So, okay. Olivia Upel saying, would you recommend covering your weeds with cardboard? They are the ones that are really hard to get rid of. We will put rocks over it and pots of flowers on top of it. So yes, I would recommend that. And I started filming a video last year, and I'll finish it this year with a part of my yard out front. And that's what I'm doing. I'm covering the whole space with cardboard. And then I'm putting soil on top of the cardboard. And then I'm putting wood chip mulch on top of that soil. And that's where I'll be putting a lot of my flowers, sunflowers, some more trees. I'll be planting elderberry in that whole spot. And the main reason I'm doing that is because it saves me from having to pull up the weeds or dig up that area. That cardboard should be enough to kill the weeds, especially in my case with the addition of the soil and the wood chips. And so in your case, with the addition of the rocks, it should kill most weeds. The problem is there are some of those really pernicious weeds that don't spread by seed, but they spread by rhizomes or by roots. Those can be more difficult to kill even with a double layer of cardboard. And so if you've got those kind of weeds that you're concerned about, I would say use a double layer of cardboard and the rocks, and it should work pretty well. But the first time you see weeds start to pop up, you've got to deal with them right away, because the rhizome spreading weeds have enough energy that they can stay alive underneath cardboard and underneath rock, but they're trying to find that spot, that gap where they're going to grow up. And once they grow up, if they can set leaves and get some photosynthesis going, they're going to stay alive. So cardboard is good, rock is great, the weeds should be minimized. You might still have some more. Deal with them right away, and then eventually you'll be able to reclaim that space, and the weeds shouldn't be a problem anymore. But there are some that are very, very difficult to get rid of, and you might even have to revert to some chemicals to deal with it if the cardboard and the rock isn't enough. Hey, Derek Olson, thank you so much for that super chat. I appreciate it. It's always nice to see you here, and I appreciate the contribution. Rupa K is asking, Gardener Scott, I have garlic in my only raised bed. Do I harvest it early so I can have the bed ready for my other veggies and add anything to the soil? Yes, you can. The big difference is that if you don't wait for the garlic to reach maturity, then it's not going to be that big bulb loaded with cloves. You can still harvest it. You can still cook with it. It still tastes like garlic. It's just you're going to have a much smaller bulb because basically it's just going to be the clove. The clove may have started to split into some smaller cloves. But if you need to reclaim part of your bed, and this holds true with any kind of plant, not just garlic. If you're growing a whole bunch of beets and you want to grow something else later on and the beets haven't fully formed the beet root, well, go ahead and harvest. You can still eat the leaves and the smaller root of beets. It just hasn't reached the mature level that you're probably trying for. So it's a personal decision, but by all means, any plant at any time, if it's in the way and you want to put something that's more important in place, do it. It's all about priorities of gardening and what's a higher priority for you. Is the garlic the high priority? Is another plant a high priority? And that's the kind of thing you need to think about. Okay, Classic Rock 1135 is asking, Gardener Scott. Hey, Scott. Hey, Classic Rock. Have you ever tried to grow giant pumpkins? If you have, do you have any tips? Yes, I have. At the school garden, we grew giant pumpkins. Had a lot of fun with it. We actually had a pumpkin festival, and so this is really cool. This shows you, I tell you how wonderful gardening is and how you can spread it to other people. So the first main year at the school garden, we grew giant pumpkins, and we had a pumpkin festival. And the drama department, this was a middle school, the drama department actually performed It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, in our pumpkin patch. And so we had a few hundred people come, mostly parents and grandparents and some local community people. And we watched the kids perform It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown in the pumpkin patch. And then we sold our pumpkins, and we had a contest to guess the weights of our giant pumpkins, and it was just so much fun. So I know this wasn't part of your question, but that was just such a great gardening experience that I wanted to share it because it really was a lot of fun. So the number one key if you want to grow giant pumpkins is you have to have a giant pumpkin seed. You can't just grow any type of pumpkin and give it a lot of water and expect that it's going to grow into a giant pumpkin. You need to have a seed that has the genetics to grow into a giant pumpkin. It's that simple. And most pumpkin plants will grow multiple pumpkins on a single plant. If you let a whole bunch of pumpkins grow on one plant, you'll get big pumpkins, but you won't get giant pumpkins. So now if you want a giant pumpkin, you got to start with the right genetics, and you've got to just grow one pumpkin on each plant. And that plant should be growing in a very nutrient-rich soil, and you need to allow that plant to continue growing. So as some of those side shoots come off of the main vine, you allow those side shoots to grow. More leaves, more photosynthesis, more growth for the pumpkin. And you've got to make sure that you keep it regularly watered. And you need to think about the sun, because a lot of pumpkins, as the summer progresses, the sun actually causes the skin to harden. And once the skin hardens, the pumpkin's not going to grow anymore at all. So you might actually need to cover or shade the actual pumpkin just so the skin stays soft. And so now all the nutrients and all the water continues to allow the pumpkin to grow. So there's a lot of moving parts between the seed and the soil and the watering and the nutrition, but do it. It's one of those things, excuse me, that when you do it, it's just great. We got a couple pumpkins that were close to 100 pounds, and that's awesome, especially when you've got school kids that are doing the growing of it. So there's a couple ideas. Hope that helps. There's some great forums out there. There's some good websites with giant pumpkin growers that you can definitely learn a lot more. And I actually do have some giant pumpkin seed that I was gifted this year. I'll be doing a video on that later. So I'll be growing some giant pumpkins this year, and the video won't come out till late in this season, so you'll be able to use it for next year. But if you want to grow giant pumpkins this year, get your seed, prepare your area, start it, and then next year when I have my video, you can watch that and see if maybe you missed something, and you can try it again next year, because it takes a while. It takes a few years of doing it to really start feeling comfortable and start seeing some of that success. So Keel Ackerman is saying, good morning, Scott. I put in raised beds last year. I had cleared an old shrub out that was infested with poison ivy. Good for you. And that's actually a great reason for doing raised beds. I think I mentioned that in one of my videos. If you've got areas like that are infested with poison ivy, that's a great reason to reclaim an area, but then use the beds, the raised beds on top of that space, so that you don't run the risk of inadvertently digging up some of the vines, and now you have a breakout on your hands and your arms. And it's also kind of like the cardboard idea. And this is one of those cases you might want to, as you add more beds, if you're at all concerned about the poison ivy coming back, this is one of those instances you would put cardboard underneath your raised bed to help avoid that potential problem. But good for you. I think that's great. Chris is asking, topsoil plus manure, good soil? It depends on the topsoil. And so I do not recommend buying soil that is called topsoil because in many cases it's just the reject dirt that's used in house construction, and they sell it as topsoil, and who knows what's in it. And I know a number of you have shared over the months the horror stories of your topsoil and finding plastic and tin cans and rocks and everything else. Your topsoil, if you've got soil in your yard, Chris, that you're digging up and you want to amend it with manure, then that's a different story. And yes, that can be great soil. I don't suggest buying bags of topsoil and then mixing it with manure. Use your own soil first, because you already got your own bacteria and fungi that should be in it. And then you add the manure and it can do well. I recommend using aged manure. Fresh manure doesn't work as well. It tends to rob nitrogen right away. But let your manure sit for 4 to 6 to 8 months and then mix it into your own soil. And yeah, that can be a great way to get your soil boosted and start growing in it. And for a number of years, that's how I did most of my gardening, was just manure and soil. And then as I made compost, I would add compost to it, and I would mulch with straw and crushed leaves. And at the end of the season, all of that got worked back into the soil. And I've shown that in some of the videos, no doubt you've seen. But manure and soil to start, yep, definitely can be a great start. Mark Goodsmith, I am in zone 5B in Colorado. And it's not only just zone 5B, and we did get down to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the lower level of zone 5B this year. But I live in a roller coaster weather environment. Today it's supposed to be 72 degrees. That's 22 degrees Celsius. And then as I mentioned earlier, it's dropping down. Tomorrow's high, I think, is supposed to be 36 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 2 degrees Celsius. So we've got almost a 40-degree change from today to tomorrow, and blowing wind of 50, 60 miles an hour, and snow coming tomorrow. So that's great, because this weekend it's warming right back up again, and I'll be outside working in the garden. So it's just craziness. Okay, let's see what Derek has to say. First year growing a new raised hugelkultur. Around 30 inches deep, have a layer of native topsoil on top of my dead wood. That's awesome. How much deeper would you make the potting mix blend on top of it? Good question. And I get asked this a lot on my hugelkultur video or in my how to fill a raised bed video. If you want to plant, and this holds true if you're just starting to fill a bed, or if you've done a hugelkultur mound and now you want to grow in it in the same year, you need to think in terms of what your plants are going to be growing in, and you need to give them that much soil. So if you've got the buried logs and you've got the native soil, and then you're going to put amended soil on top of that, a lot of it depends on what kind of plants you're going to grow. And so I suggest at least 8 inches of amended soil. And so that's soil with compost, that's soil with aged manure, that's soil that has some organic matter in it. And that 8 inches should be enough for most plants that you're going to grow. And so last year I did my hugelkultur mound. If you saw that video, I dug out a trench, I buried logs, I put in native soil, I put organics on top of it, and that is the mound that I grew my pumpkins and squash in last year. And they did better than just about any other plant in my garden. Well, the key was I had about 8 to 10 inches of amended soil on top of all of that buried branches and logs and twigs. And then I mulched on top of that. Now, if you're growing plants that require more soil, then you should have more soil on top of it. So I would suggest for tomatoes, for instance, if you're going to try to grow tomatoes over a hugelkultur mound, I'd put at least 12 inches of amended soil on top of those logs. So depends on the plant, depends on how much amended soil you have, but you can, in all cases, with brand new beds this year, grow any plants that you want to. You don't have to do like I do, where I do all the prep in the fall, and then in the spring it's ready to go. You can start right off in the spring as long as you give the plant roots enough room to grow. And that's usually at least 8 inches. Most plants will be able to deal with that without too big a problem. Okay, let's see. Bicky B, the fluffy redneck, is saying, at Gardener Scott, do you have any plants you love to either grow, eat, but can't grow due to living in Colorado? Good question. And I touch on this occasionally, and I'm actually planning a video that is exactly this topic. The plants I would love to grow, but I can't. And some of them are fruits. The fruits, you know, like the mangoes and the papayas, there's just no way I can grow it. But some of them are as simple as blueberries. My soil is bordering on alkaline soil, and blueberries require acidic soil. I'd love to grow blueberries, but my soil just doesn't allow me to grow the blueberries. There's also a lot of the plants like okra that I would love to grow, but it's just so... I am going to be growing okra this year as an experiment because I've had so little success with okra. I just don't have the long season and the heat that's needed to grow a plant like okra. So those are two of the big ones on my list of things that I'd like to grow, but I can't. And then there are other. There's the big beefsteak tomatoes. I'd love to grow big beefsteak tomatoes, but my season is just too short. And so I tend to try to choose the plants that will give me 80 days to harvest, 90 on the outside, and some of those big beefsteak tomatoes require over 100 days to get to harvest, and I just don't have that long a season. And I've tried and just haven't been able to do it. So yes, there's a lot of plants like that require longer seasons, that require a specific type of soil and require hotter conditions that I just can't do. And also plants like cauliflower. Cauliflower doesn't do well in my region. You can grow it, but it's very small. I can't get the big cauliflower heads. And celery. I live in a very dry area. And so celery doesn't do well in my area because it requires moister conditions than I can usually give my plants. So there you have it. There's a handful of plants that I wish I could grow that I know others are doing with great success, and I just haven't been able to do it. So let's see what else we have. Chris is saying, how are you feeling? I'm feeling pretty good, starting to deal with some of the allergy issues as the spring starts changing and we start getting some pollen in the air and a few molds that are starting to grow on the moist soil. Thanks for asking, Chris, but I'm doing pretty good. Nicole is saying, Gardener Scott, hello from Tucson. Hello to you. What do you look for when harvesting artichokes? I'm trying not to think Costco-sized artichokes. Thanks for sharing your wisdom. Artichokes is another one of those plants that I wish I could grow more. And so I'll be growing artichokes, not this year. I still need to prepare the bed. I'll be doing artichokes next year. But for me at least, and I think for many gardeners, it's the choice of the artichoke, the variety of the artichoke. And so artichoke can be a perennial plant for many gardeners. It can survive winters. I think it's usually zone 7. It depends on the variety though. Now there are some artichokes that you can grow that grow very give you the big store size, full size artichoke that you're going to cook up and eat. It is going to be much smaller, but it's all about the variety. So look at how long your season is, and depending on what your zone is, you can choose the type of artichoke that it will either grow very quickly and give you some of the smaller artichokes, or you can put one in place. In Arizona, my guess is you can grow a perennial artichoke. And so look at the variety and find out just exactly which type it is. And I wouldn't be surprised if you couldn't set up a nice artichoke patch with some good rich soil and then start enjoying artichokes for years to come once you get those established. Artichokes take up a lot of space. So if you're thinking about putting in an artichoke bed, again, you need to look at the variety and anticipate how big it's going to grow. And once you set up that space and give it the size and choose the right variety, artichokes would be a wonderful thing to add to your garden. So good luck with that. Scott Head, good to see you here. Scott, my soil test reveals a significant lack of potassium. What's your preferred method of boosting that? And so that's a good question. So those of you that don't know, Scott Head has his own channel. It's the Black Gumbo Gardening channel. He just went over 100,000 subscribers. Congratulations, Scott. I know a lot of you also like to watch Scott's videos. And so potassium is one of those things. And again, it depends. So one of the easiest ways to add potassium to your soil is by adding wood ash. Now, one of the problems with using wood ash is it raises soil pH. And so many areas of the United States, that's the preferred method, is to mix wood ash into the soil because they have an acidic soil. And so I'm not sure, Scott, what your pH is in your area of Texas, but if you're below neutral, you might consider mixing in some wood ash and then just do a simple home pH test to make sure that you haven't raised the pH too high. And that can be a very effective way of raising potassium. Another option is manure. Manures generally are a great way to add potassium to soil. And so that's what I do. Horse manure in particular tends to have a relatively high component of potassium. Most manures do. And so because I can't use the wood ash in my garden, I'll use manures. And that not only helps with the organic matter and helps enrich the soil, but also boosts a little bit of the potassium level. Now, the pH is a big factor because a lot of times, and this is one of those things, and I won't be getting into soil chemistry too much, but the pH of your soil can affect how effectively the potassium will be used by the plants. And that's one reason why when you get into a high alkaline environment, the potassium can really become a problem because the plants can't even absorb it. But those are a couple different methods. Of course, you can use a fertilizer and use one of those high potassium slow release fertilizers. Another way to do it, if you're looking for slow release over time, is green sand. And I bet you wouldn't have any trouble finding green sand in Texas, because I think some of it actually comes from some areas of Texas. So look at green sand. That's a mineral-based way of raising the potassium of your soil. So there you have it. Between manure and ash and green sand, you should be able to get your levels up to a suitable state for your plants. Hopes that helped, but it's always good to see you. Okay, yeah, your pH is around 7.5 to 8. That is way out of whack. And so I would say think in terms of the manure, because the organic matter, if you've got soil that's really out of whack like that, really alkaline or really acidic, organic matter is a great way to buffer your soil and bring it closer to a neutral pH. It's crazy. If you ever want to look at some of the university studies, you can do some searches online and see the results of some of the studies that have been done about that. But organic matter in soil tends to neutralize the pH of the soil. And so if it's out of whack, especially if it's got potassium deficiency, manures may be the solution to not only help get your pH closer to neutral, but also help raise some of the potassium levels. And green sand is obviously one of those things. It has no effect on the pH to speak of, and can also boost the potassium levels. So there you have it. Okay, Laura Laspy says, when should we turn our beds to mix the leaf mulch in? And so I try to do it in the spring as early as possible. And so for me, we're just about at April 1st, and I'm going to be putting most of my plants in on June 1st. And days like today that are getting so warm, it's going to at least in my garden where most of my ground is still frozen, it's going to start thawing out my raised beds. Another reason why I grow in raised beds, because they thaw out earlier. And so that's what I'm already starting to do in some of my beds. I'm already starting to turn in some of that straw and crushed leaves that I had on top over the winter. And I've got 2 months between now and when I'm actually putting plants in the ground. I like to give myself a 2-month buffer for my soil. And so the earlier the better. As soon as you can work your soil in spring, if you're planning on mixing in some of that organic matter, do it as soon as you can, so that all of that biology within the soil can come to life and start eating, decomposing that organic matter. And you should be able to see some good results with that. So Glenn Davey is asking, do I amend my raised beds with rock dust? I don't. And so back to Scott Head's point of a soil test will tell you what your soil is deficient in. And I live near the Rocky Mountains, and my soil has ample amounts of most minerals. So I have no need to amend with rock dust, because after having done a soil test, I know that my soil doesn't need rock dust. It already has the appropriate minerals. So that's why I just add organic matter, like the compost and the leaves and the straw and the manure, and try to get that worked into my soil, because the minerals are already there. If you're growing in a container with a soilless mix, so if you have a potting soil mix and you're growing in a container, then I would add rock dust. But most of my container gardening is just for a single year. And so instead of doing rock dust, I use fertilizers, slow release fertilizers, when I mix up my potting soil. But I am planning in the future to do some fruit trees in big pots. And when I do that, yes, I will probably use some rock dust just to make sure I get that mineral component mixed into that mix. Because plants, too often we think in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, and then we might be concerned about calcium if we're growing our peppers and tomatoes, and we might be concerned about copper. And so there's the primary nutrients that we're thinking about with our plants, and too seldom do we really think about the minerals that our plants need. And so I don't think it's necessary to use rock dust on a regular basis in a raised bed or in the ground if you're using your native soil in most cases. But for container gardening, yeah, rock dust is definitely something to do, but I haven't done much of it. Tasha Rucker, welcome to Garden Training. Tasha Rucker just joined the channel community. So good to see you here, Tasha, and hope to see you more as you see some of the benefits of being a member of the Gardener Scout community. That's awesome. Welcome to you. Okay, let's see what else we have popping up here. Any other questions? Groovin Bird says, better late than never. Hope all are well. So what I miss, just kidding. We'll watch from the beginning. Well, what you missed is actually talking just about that if you do come in late, you can watch it on replay. So you'll see not only me saying go back to the beginning and catch up, but during the beginning, I'll be saying that's how you catch up is if you come in late. So I'm glad you're here, even if you are checking in late. That's great. Taco Promotions, Gardener Scott, I have had passion fruit seeds growing for almost a year. It's 20 feet, but I still see no flowers. Do you have any advice on how to stimulate flowering? Passion fruit is one of those things I can't grow in my area, but most fruit trees, particularly if you're growing them from seed, it's I won't say rare, but it's not common for you to get flowers and fruit in your first year. And so most of the time, most of the fruit bushes and trees that I can grow, that first year that it's just getting established. Most of the energy is going into the root development. You might have a little bit of patience. You might still get a flower or two, but my guess is that you'll see most of the flowering in the second year. The first year, the plant is just getting established. And there's a lot of fruit trees out there that won't even flower until the third, fourth, or fifth year. I can't speak specifically to passion fruit, but it's normal for fruit trees to take years before they flower and set fruit. And so I wouldn't be too concerned if you haven't got it in your first year. If any of you have grown passion fruit and have something else to add, by all means, throw that out there. So Patrick, thank you for that contribution. It says the message is retracted, so I don't know what you were going to ask, but thank you so much for throwing that super chat up there. And if you have the question pop up again, go ahead and throw it out there. Garden Girl is asking, when I bought the pre-potted bulbs, they had been out on a rack uncovered. Are they hardened off? And so bulbs, you really don't need to harden off. The process of saving bulbs causes the outer part of that bulb, that paper cover, to dry. And that's what protects the bulb from drying out and allows it to stay viable for months usually. And so you really don't need to harden off the bulbs. Now, if the plant is actually growing and you have, especially if you got flowers coming from those bulbs, and that potted plant is indoors, then yes, you'll need to harden it off for a period of time before you leave the pot outside. But if you're just talking about the bulbs themselves, I wouldn't worry about it. Now, if you're talking about the racks, that the bulbs were in the pot sitting on the rack at the garden center or at your nursery, it depends. And so a lot of my local nurseries will have their plants on the racks underneath the domes or in the greenhouse. Yes, all of those do need to be hardened off. Even though the sunlight is what's shining through the plastic, the plant is growing in an environment that's completely protected. They need to be hardened off. But if you're buying your plants from a garden center where those racks are sitting outside, and now the pot and the plant is growing outside, then yes, those have been hardened off. So it all depends. It all depends on the entire environment and whether the plant is actively growing as to whether you need to harden it off in your garden. So let's see what else we have. Derek, good to see you. Can I grow strawberries in a raised bed that had tomatoes last season? I've read that it shouldn't be done, but I have limited space. Yeah, I don't see a problem with that. I know there's a lot of concern about growing plants from one year to the next, shared in another area. Some of that has to do with the nutrients, where tomatoes are relatively heavy feeders and might be sucking up the nutrients that the strawberries need. As long as you're amending with organic matter every year, I don't have any issue with having to rotate crops. If you know that your tomatoes were diseased, then I wouldn't grow anything that second year to give time for the soil to recover, but strawberries aren't an issue. Now, how long are you planning to grow your strawberries in that bed? Because you'll have strawberries for 3 years to come with those plants that you're putting in this year. So as long as you've got the space and you're dedicating it to strawberries, I don't see a problem putting them in a tomato bed. In fact, I grew strawberries in one of my tomato beds last year, and both the strawberries and the tomatoes did fine. So I don't think there's too many issues to be concerned about with them. Not applicable, saying, I'm overwhelmed by pH testers and test kits. Can someone please just tell me what to do and buy? Are the little digital meters snake oil? Should I get the strips? I'm a complete newbie and it shows. Don't worry about being a newbie. That's a good question. I'm not a big fan of the meters, the digital meters. They tend to be okay in the beginning. You'll get different readings, whether the soil is moist or whether the soil is dry. And once those probes have started to corrode a little bit, then the meters the readings start being off a little bit. For just a basic pH test, you can get a home test. You can get those strips, and that will give you a general idea of whether you're close to neutral or alkaline or acidic. That's the purpose of doing a home test kit like that, or using the strips. It's to give you a general idea so that as you start choosing your plants, it gives you an idea of what kind of plants to choose, whether you can grow blueberries or not, for instance. The organic matter, like I said earlier, will buffer your soil and get it closer to neutral. The only way you're really going to get an accurate pH reading is to send your soil to a laboratory for analysis. And there are some home kits that you can buy, and they'll send it to you, and then you send it back to them and they'll test it at the lab. I've done mine through Colorado State University's testing labs. Most places all around the world, you should be able to find a university near you that does soil testing. And the soil testing should include pH, and it will give you an exact reading of your soil. That's the best way to do it. Otherwise, there's nothing wrong with the test kits, but they do border on snake oil. You're not going to get as accurate a reading with a probe, with a strip, with one of those little dye packs that you mix with water. It'll be close, but the most accurate is a laboratory test, and that's what I always recommend, at least in the beginning. So if you're just starting off with gardening and you're just building your garden, you should have a soil test done in your very first year. You probably don't need to do it again for 3 to 5 years, and then you can do it again to see if all of your effort is paying off, if all that organic matter you're working in has changed the pH, and you'll probably see that it has. You also see that your nutrients have improved. But get that baseline right off the bat. I did. And you can go back and see my video. I've got a couple videos on how to do a soil test and then how to read the results of the soil test. And if you look at that video, you'll see that I have nothing in my backyard, because that was one of the very first things I did. Before I put in a single bed, I did a soil test. That way I knew as I began putting in my beds how much effort I needed to do and how much work was involved, if I could use my own soil, if I needed to bring in soil, how much I needed to amend the soil. All of that I knew by doing that initial soil test. And that actually plays in with some of what I wanted to talk about today. And I know I've been answering some questions already about the soil and the bed prep for spring. Soil tests should be on that list. Early in spring, if you're thinking about creating a garden, expanding your garden, adding to your garden, a soil test is something that you should do in the spring if you haven't already done it. That way, as you progress through the season, you don't have to ask so many questions. I get asked questions all the time, virtually every day. I'm growing, fill in the blank. How should I fertilize it? And my answer is always, it depends on your soil. Too often, you have many of us that are making videos and doing blogs, and we'll say, fertilize your tomatoes this way, and fertilize your corn that way, and fertilize all these other plants 3 times a year. Well, I think a lot of that is misplaced guidance, because if you've got good soil, you probably don't need to fertilize at all. If you've got bad soil, a balanced fertilizer may not be appropriate, or a high phosphate fertilizer may not be appropriate. You have to know your soil. You have to know what it has in it and what it is deficient in. That will determine what kind of fertilizer and how much fertilizer to use. Because too often, and you've heard me say this before, for those of you that watch the live stream every week, we want to feed our plants. That's the way we're taught. We fertilize our plants. That's not the right way to approach it. You need to approach it from, what does my soil need to make my plant happy? And so when you're feeding your soil, that's the really best way to do it. And you feed your soil based on what it's hungry in. If you have a soil that's deficient in potassium, then you find out ways to add potassium by putting the manures or the green sand in it. If you've got a soil that's deficient in nitrogen, then you add things like blood meal and kelp and manures to add nitrogen to your soil. It all depends on the deficiencies of your soil to make that determination. And as you move into spring, by all means, add organic matter if you didn't do it in the fall, and add that organic matter as early as possible. But when it comes to the specific nutrients, like the fertilizers, even the slow release fertilizers, be aware of what you're doing based on the soil. And so I know, based on the soil test that I did a little over a year ago, that my soil is deficient in nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. So every spring, and you'll see this in a video coming up soon, every spring I'll spread a balanced fertilizer, slow release, at the same time that I'm adding organic matter. The organic matter is to improve the soil for the plants, and that slow release fertilizer is to augment the deficiencies that I know are already in place for my native soil. So there's some general ideas of how to approach the soil preparation for the spring. Organic matter is always a good idea, until you get to the point that you've got so much organic matter it can hinder the plant growth. And that's why I encourage doing plant tests every 3 to 5 years, because at some point, all of this effort that you're making will have done its job. And now your soil is good. It doesn't need any more care and attention. But you won't know that until you get the soil test done 5 years from now to show that you have an abundance or a balance of whatever those nutrients happen to be. So got to get the soil test. You can get an idea from the test kits that you can buy at the garden center, but you really need a lab to tell you specifically. So Heidi, good to see you as always, wondering about whose garden this is. This is my garden today, and I wanted to show this because this is actually from last year, and I'm dying to have some color in my garden. I started seeds, and my petunia seeds are growing, or I should say the plants are growing. They germinated, they're growing well. I up-potted a lot of my petunias this last week, and so now I have petunias growing in some yogurt cups, and I wanted to go ahead and show this picture for a reminder, not only to me, but also to motivate you all a little bit. These plants that you see behind me, I grew all of these from seed last year. The Gaillardia I grew from seed last year. The petunias I grew from seed last year, and I'm doing it again this year. And so just wanted to give a little boost to you and me to show what you can do. We too often think about starting seeds indoors as tomatoes and peppers and eggplant. And we don't, too many of us at least, think in terms of the flowers that we're going to put in our landscape. So I try to grow as much as possible from seed to include the flowers. And I love petunias. These petunias behind me, I got 3 distinct bloom seasons out of these plants. I got an early summer bloom, I got a late summer bloom, and I actually got an early fall bloom on these petunias, and I just love them. So I'm growing them again this year, and I'll be putting them into this same spot. I'm growing more plants this year than I grew last year, and I'll be spreading them all throughout my garden. So thanks for asking that, Heidi. This is my own garden. Patrick, there's a question, and thank you again for that contribution. Hairy vetch, cut, drop, pull with roots, drop. How long before using in the bed? So I grow, so hairy vetch is a great cover crop, and I grow a lot of hairy vetch. This might be why you're asking, because you've seen some of my videos where I talk about hairy vetch. And so hairy vetch is a legume. It can actually take nitrogen from the air and put it into nodules, and the nitrogen in those nodules can improve the soil. If you cut the plant before the flowers develop, because once the flowers develop, especially when it sets seed, the plant is using all of that nitrogen. So any cover crop that you're planning to use for the purpose of adding nitrogen to your soil, go ahead and cut it before flowers develop. And vetch is a perfect example of this. And so I do vetch a couple of different ways. So as a cover crop to improve the soil, I will cut it and leave the root in the ground. I don't pull it. And then because it spreads so much, it actually becomes a great mulch. And so in a lot of the beds that I'm growing my vetch, I'll cut it at the root, leave the root in the ground, and then just leave the plant on the surface for it to dry and become a mulch. And it's a fairly effective mulch. And then depending on what I'm growing in that bed, I can plant in between the drying vetch leaves, and then I'll throw straw on top of it. So that also adds some nitrogen from that plant as it decomposes on the surface of the soil. When I want to amend my compost or add a good nitrogen component to my compost pile, I'll pull up the vetch before it flowers. And now I'll have some of that nitrogen from those root nodules, and I'll have the green leaves from the plant, and it can be a really nice nitrogen boost for the compost pile. So I like to do that as well. And then I've got the hairy vetch growing in areas where I'm not doing it for the soil improvement. I'm doing it as a way to hinder the weed growth, because again, it's a very effective mulch. Those leaves will cover an area and weeds won't grow through it. And in those areas where I'm just protecting the bed until I put something in later in the season, I'll let the vetch flower. And it's a great plant for the bees and for a lot of other pollinators. It's got a beautiful flower. And so I use vetch in a number of different ways, but it all comes down to what your intent is, whether you want to pull it and add it to your compost pile, cut it off for the soil improvement, leave it in place as a living mulch, or as an attractant to beneficial insects. So hope that helps. Sue Pfeiffer, thank you so much for that super chat contribution. I really appreciate it. Hey, Tony, I see Simplify Gardening checking in. Good to have you here from Wales in the UK. Didn't see a video from you last week, Tony. I was going to send you a message soon. I hope you're well, and I hope we have videos coming out. Tony on the Simplify Gardening channel, a lot of you know this already. A lot of you are viewers of Tony's videos along with Scott Head's videos, but check out the Simplify Gardening channel. I'm going to be doing some videos on growing potatoes this year. Most of what I've learned from growing potatoes has come from Tony. I think he's one of the world experts on YouTube when it comes to growing potatoes. So good to see you here today, Tony. Glad you could check in. Olivia is asking, what is the benefits of putting marigolds in your vegetable garden? So marigolds are one of those plants that I think it's a great plant to grow. I think some of the attributes have been oversold a little bit. I've seen people saying put in marigolds to keep deer out of your garden, put in marigolds to defeat disease. Marigold is supposed to be a magic plant, and it doesn't do a lot of the things that it's sold as doing, but it's a beautiful plant. It attracts a huge number of beneficial insects and pollinators. It does have a pretty strong fragrance, and I anecdotally have seen that in some of the beds that I grow, marigolds don't seem to have the rabbits hanging around, but I don't have that big a rabbit problem. But the benefits of marigold is just, it's a beautiful plant. It flowers later in the year, and that's why I like to grow marigolds, because for the pollinators and for the beneficial insects, you need to have flowers growing throughout the season from start to finish. And too many of us are just focusing on the spring flowering flowers, and we don't think about those flowers in the summer and early fall. And so marigolds are one of those flowers where you're going to get late season blooms, beautiful blooms, when a lot of the spring flowers have faded. And that's one of the biggest benefits, is just the time of year that the marigolds are blooming. That's why I do it. Time of season. There might be some benefits because of the aroma. It might deter some animal pests from particular beds. But for most of us, we have gardens that have multiple beds, and a few marigolds here or there really aren't going to deter those animal pests. So instead, grow it for your own benefit. Grow it to attract those beneficial insects and have that late season color. So hope that helps out. That's the main reason that I do it. So let's see what else we have popping up. Jay Dixon, thank you for that. Jay just put a link to Tony's Simplified Gardening channel. You are so awesome. Awesome, Jay. And let's see what else we have popping up. Greg Daner says, but I love growing them for late season blooms and they really last a long time. Oh, there you go. So I'm guessing you're talking about the same plants I was just talking about as well. Late season blooms, that's what it's all about. Okay, and ancient gardening also has a good point. Most, if not all, plants have flowers if we let them bloom. That's a really good point to raise. So much of what we grow, we are growing for a very specific reason. So we're growing beets for the beet root. And we might also harvest the leaves for salads, or if you want to make a nice saute. And then when the beet root forms, or when the leaves start changing flavor, we pull up the beetroot and we're done with it. They have beautiful flowers. So if you leave some of your beets in the ground, they'll flower. It takes time, but it's a wonderful flower. And a lot of these plants that we're growing, a lot of these root vegetables are biennials. So it's the second season that you will see the flowers. Think about that this year. Leave some of your plants in the ground after the point that you might normally leave them and see what happens. Radishes, I'll be doing a video on radishes this year where I'll show the whole progress. I just did the video on saving spinach seeds. I'm planning one to do here in a few months on radish seeds as well. I love the radish seeds, or the radish flowers. And then once those flowers set seed, it's a beautiful pod that develops on the radishes. So thanks for raising that point, because there's just so much new variety you can see in your garden by allowing some of your plants to continue growing past the point that you would normally harvest them. And radishes, you might get white flowers, you might get purple flowers. You might even get a pinkish flower. It's amazing the colors that start appearing in your garden when you allow some of these plants to continue growing, bolt in the summer, set their flowers, set their seed. And especially if it's an open pollinated plant, you can save the seed for the next year. So yeah, grow some plants. I do it every year. I'll pull out most of the plants in the bed, but I always try to leave some of them behind just to see what happens when the plant grows and reaches that flower point. Simplified Gardening, Tony saying, I put onions and beets back in from last year to go to seed so that they will flower soon. Exactly. That's awesome. And it's so cool when you can let your own plants flower and save the seed and then put them back in the next year. The spinach I'm growing this year is from the seed that I saved from this last season, and it's just from letting things go to flower. And spinach is unique in the way it flowers and seeds. So check out that video out if you haven't seen them yet. Sandra Sagassi is saying, just joining in from Fort Collins, Colorado. Hope to learn so much from your experience in Colorado. Well, welcome, Sandra. It's good to have you here today. I'm guessing it's pretty windy for you as well. We were talking about the wind in Colorado at the beginning of the live stream today. And so I hope you can learn a lot too. Lots and lots of videos. And sure, I'm in Colorado Zone 5B. All of my videos are coming from my gardens over the last few years. But of course, the lessons that we can all teach each other, really doesn't matter where you're gardening. We're all gardeners and we can all learn from somebody, even if they're not growing in the exact same environment that we are. So good to have you here. I hope you can catch up on some of this stuff that you missed. So, and Chris is saying, got a tree of shed wood. Okay. Thanks for that comment. It's funny. Pauline Stewart is saying, we need a t-shirt that say, what would Gardener Scott do? Thanks for that suggestion. I might just have to add that to the list. I try to wear my shirts just because when I come up with a saying for a t-shirt, it's a saying that governs how I garden. And so I like to spread it to the world. Below my videos, if you're interested in t-shirts, you can always click on one of those links and it'll take you to the t-shirt store. And occasionally I add a new t-shirt, but what would Gardener Scott do? WWGSD. That's fun. I can play with that, see if I can come up with a nice t-shirt design and add that to the list. I think I've got 14 or 15 different t-shirt sayings on my different t-shirts right now. So that's I guess it's time to start thinking about creating some new ones. So yeah, thanks, Trudy's fun. That is kind of humorous. So, talking about the flowers and the seeds, this kind of leads in a little bit to what I wanted to talk about with the philosophy today, specifically the idea of seeds. And so, too many of us right now in the spring, for those of us in the northern hemisphere, or in the fall for those of us that are in the southern hemisphere, we think in terms of the garden and growing our plants or cleaning up the garden or planning the garden for next year. And that's so easy to do. We're gardeners. We think big picture. We think about all the plants. We think about all the beds. We think about the environment. And you should have that as part of your mental process when it comes to gardening, to develop your plan. But start thinking even smaller than that. Bring it down to the smallest point. And when you start thinking about gardening from that individual seed, when you think about gardening from that individual flower, when you think about gardening from that one bug you see crawling on the leaf, you really can approach gardening from a perspective that I think will make you a much better gardener. Have you ever taken a seed and just looked at it and compared that seed to another seed of the same type or a different type? I was doing this with my pepper seeds last week as I was putting some pepper seeds in trays to grow. And I noticed that all the pepper seeds look the same, but they also look different. They've got different wrinkles to them, and some of the shapes are a little bit more pronounced, and some of the seeds are bigger than other seeds. And so you've got a handful of pepper seeds. They're all the same, but they're all different. And it's that difference that I started looking at and wondering, will the fatter seeds grow better than the skinny seeds? Will the bigger seeds grow better than the smaller seeds? Will a seed with more wrinkles grow better than a smooth seed? And I don't have all the answers to that. And that opens up the opportunity to experiment a little bit with pepper seeds or any type of seed. But then looking at the seed again, just the amazement of how that little seed with its wrinkles and its shape, will grow into a pepper plant. And when the pepper plant grows, now I need to think about, do I top the plant? How do I prune it? Do I pluck off the flowers before I transplant? Again, those are the big picture thoughts. Bring it back down. So when you grow your pepper plant from seed, and then you put it in your garden, as those flowers develop, now start thinking about those individual flowers. And peppers have what we call a perfect flower. The pepper flower has both the male and the female reproductive organs in it. Well, what does that mean? Look inside a pepper plant. Look at the pistil. Look at the stigma. Look at the pollen. Try to learn about how a flower pollinates, and especially with a pepper flower, how does it pollinate itself? This is another area of absolute amazement. When we were talking about asparagus earlier, a dioecious plant that has male flowers, and then another plant has female flowers. Well, you can look at these different flowers and you can see the male parts or the female parts, and you can start figuring out how pollination works and how the pollen is transferred from one male flower to a female flower and vice versa. But with a pepper, all of that takes place in the same flower. How does that work? Well, take the time to figure it out. Take the time to pull off the petals of a pepper flower and then identify what's happening inside it. And when you see that insect land on the pepper plant and start crawling into the flower, pay close attention. Can you see it picking up the pollen? And then when it flits to another flower, now you're seeing nature in action. Sure, a pepper can pollinate itself within the same flower, but it does better when it's pollinated from one plant to another. Most plants do that. Most fruits do better. Even if they're a self-pollinating tree, you'll get more fruit if you have another tree of the same basic type, a different variety, and it can be pollinated side by side, you'll get better results. A lot of plants work that way. So get down and actually think about the pollination by looking at a flower, and then within the flower, looking at the parts of the petal and the parts of the stigma and the parts of every aspect of that plant. Learn how there's a difference between female flowers and male flowers on different plants. This is so easy to see on squashes, and I've shown this in some of my videos where you can actually see the ovary right there on the flower. That's where the fruit's going to develop, and you can see it by just getting down and looking at the plant and looking at those smallest parts of the plant. So I wanted to talk about this today because this is the time of year when we start seeing things emerge from the soil. We start seeing what's happening with the seeds. We start seeing with the plants. This last week, I had my first crocus flowers appear, and it made me pause. I stopped. I got down on my knees to look at the very first flowers of spring, because it's just so incredible to get down and to think that these little purple flowers with their little yellow centers with the pollen that's ready to be spread, they're growing in frozen ground. My ground is still pretty darn cold. I've got snow that these crocus are growing up through. How does that happen? I don't have all the answers, but it makes me wonder. It makes me ask the questions. It makes me want to find out why and how by just looking at a single flower. My tulips have broken ground. My daffodils have broken ground. Same thing. It just makes me stop and look and think about how that little bit of green that's just popping up through the mulch is going to turn into a plant. And then it's going to flower. And it's going to be in flower for 2 weeks, and then it's done. And then the leaves fade, and then it's gone for the rest of the season. Why? How? It's just such an incredible experience that this bulb that we planted a rhizome, a tuber, a corm, whatever it is from the type of flower that we've put into the ground, it can be waiting in that cold, frozen ground for the right conditions to send its first stalk up. And then a month later, it's already flowered and done for the year. But it's got enough energy to go back into that bulb, and it just waits for a whole nother year. Isn't that fascinating? I think it's fascinating, which is why I have to stop. I have to stop so often and just enjoy my garden, just enjoy nature, enjoy everything that's happening. I like to try to figure out what's going on, and that's what I'm suggesting, is look at all these little things, these individual parts of gardening, and try to figure it out. And if you can figure out what's happening with that bulb in the ground that's going to grow into a tulip, well, maybe it will help you as you grow garlic, because the process is exactly the same. But we're harvesting the garlic to use in our kitchen. If you can figure out what's happening with that pepper seed that's going to grow and then become a flower, and you understand the pollination of the pepper flower, well, that might help you out as you're growing the beans and the tomatoes and all the other things in your garden that might not be doing as well because of a pollination issue. So put that in your bag of tricks. Add that to how you approach gardening, and at every opportunity. Sure, think about the big picture. Think about the whole garden. Think about all the beds. Think about all the plants. Think about all the work you have to do. But occasionally just stop, slow down, and break gardening down to the simplest components. Because when you understand those simple parts of gardening, all the rest becomes so much easier. You can have so much success in so many other areas because you understand the simplicity that gardening really is. And it's in the simplicity that sometimes we can really find the beauty and the enjoyment of gardening. So there's your philosophy for the week. I'm looking forward to another incredible week. Once we can get past the winds today and the snow tomorrow, that'll bring us into some good weather. I'm going to be putting up some hoops this week covered with plastic, and I'm going to be starting some of my cold weather seeds. I'll be putting in my beets and my turnips and my spinach and my chard and my lettuce, and I'll even be putting in the radishes that I'm going to be making or growing for that specific video that I mentioned. All that's happening for me this week. What's happening for you this week? I hope you're going to have a great gardening week. And I hope when we all get back together again next Monday, you'll have lots of stories to tell. And maybe with that simplicity, you'll see some things you didn't see before. Maybe it'll generate some questions. So bring all of that back again next Monday, where I hope to see you all again. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.